sexy guys do. Explore what's all in their minds. Thinking about a thing or two, about a thing or two, about a thing or two. Mansplaining is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain. There can be no thinking that would be uncool.
Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name's Mark, and I'll be your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Joe, our topic for this week is something that has really been in the air, at least in the media that I've been consuming.
Yes.
If the claims are accurate, then there's a reason for that. Because I was checking the history, and penicillin was first discovered almost exactly 100 years ago. It was in 1928, though it wasn't mass-produced until the early 40s. And so the people who are comparing the GLP-1 drugs, which we'll be discussing today, to penicillin in terms of its potential medical impact, are in a sense saying this is a once-in-a-century discovery. Obviously, as we'll be going through today, it was originally diagnosed for diabetes, but then people who were taking it within studies reported significant weight loss, and there's been applications within addictive cravings and a whole host of other conditions. And then every now and then you hear a naysayer who says that actually these drugs are not all they're cracked up to be. So it seemed like a fairly complicated scenario to figure out what exactly was going on here. So I appreciated the opportunity to send you off to do my homework for me and come back with your answer to the question, are GLP-1 drugs in fact a medical marvel that is going to have a profound impact on public health? Or are they simply too good to be true? So what did you find?
Well, the first thing I found is that there was an awful lot of homework for this episode. I probably read more sources for this episode than any other because there's been so much written about this topic, especially in recent years. I actually had to cut myself off at some point, and I'm just curious, has that ever happened to you on a topic I've given you?
Oh, yeah. Sometimes I just figure I've gone too far down this rat hole already. I just need to report on what I've learned so far instead of trying to master absolutely everything on the topic.
Yeah. So I had that experience this time, but hopefully I've gathered together the most important information about the subject. But I want to start by clarifying something for our listeners. You know that catchy tune you hear in all those Ozempic commercials?
Looking to get back in your type 2 diabetes zone? Once weekly Ozempic can help. Ozempic.
It's not original to Ozempic. It comes from one of my favorite pop songs in the 1970s, Magic by the band Pilot.
Ho, 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 it's magic. You know, never believe it's not so.
Yeah, I remember that one. That was a big thing when I was a kid.
Yeah, big song of the 70s. And I loved it. And I sincerely hope its songwriters are well compensated for the number of times that tune has been used on TV. Okay, GLP is an acronym for glucagon-like peptide and is often used with the number 1 or 2 indicating the specific peptide. Peptides are hormones secreted by the small intestine when nutrients like carbohydrates or fats are present. GLP-1 stimulates the secretion of insulin and inhibits the secretion of glucagon, a protein hormone that increases the amount of glucose or blood sugar. The technical term for the drugs you're asking about is GLP-1 receptor agonists. The word agonist being a medical term to describe substances that mimic the actions of hormones. In 2005, the Food and Drug Administration approved the development of GLP-1 drugs because they lower and control blood sugar levels and are therefore useful in treating type 2, that's adult onset diabetes, which accounts for 90% of the diabetic population. So these drugs have been around for 20 years, but as we'll see, their potential uses have expanded greatly in those 2 decades. Most GLP-1 drugs are administered by injection either once a day or once a week, but some of the newer ones are in pill form. Most of us know these drugs by their brand names due to the incessant advertising I alluded to a minute ago. There's Ozempic, of course, but also Wegovy, Trulicity, Zepbound, Mounjaro, and several others. There's another group of medicines for treating type 2 diabetes called SGLT2 inhibitors. You may know them by their brand names like Farxiga and Jardiance. Though your question was about GLP-1 drugs specifically, it's worth noting that GLP-1 receptor agonists and SGLT2 inhibitors are often lumped together because of their similar uses, and much of the research I'm about to discuss applies to both. As many people now know, and as you teased at the top, GLP-1 drugs are also helpful in promoting weight loss. Before I get into that part of the story, a quick question for you, Mark. So many medical breakthroughs are based on animal research. Can you tell me what animal's digestive system paved the way for the development of GLP-1 drugs?
I certainly do not know the answer to that question, so I'm wondering what's the best guess. I'm going to go with pigs.
That's incorrect. It's the Gila monster.
Oh, that was going to be my second guess.
It's native to North America's deserts, and it can survive on just a few meals a year, thanks to a hormone in its venom that slows digestion.
Okay.
Ozempic is the brand name of an injectable GLP-1 drug called semaglutide that was approved for type 2 diabetes in the early 2010s. But when users started reporting significant weight loss while taking it, the manufacturer of Ozempic, the Danish company Novo Nordisk, ran further clinical trials and discovered that semaglutide was associated with diminished hunger and food cravings. So they re-released it for weight loss in a higher dosage and with a new brand name, Wegovy. Doctors began prescribing them off-label to treat obesity, and off-label means before receiving formal FDA approval. They prescribed them for patients who could afford paying out of pocket. It's still not clear exactly how GLP-1 drugs work for weight loss. They appear to decrease food intake by slowing the emptying of the stomach and food's movement to the small intestine. They affect areas of the brain that make you feel full faster and longer, curbing the food noise of hunger signals and reducing your appetite. Just as the data and FDA approvals came in confirming GLP-1's effectiveness for weight loss, researchers began learning about more of their beneficial uses. It turns out that some GLP-1 drugs lower the risk of serious illnesses like heart disease, stroke, and kidney disease. As a result, doctors began prescribing them off-label for those uses as they waited for clinical studies to be processed and reviewed by the FDA. The data has been dribbling in, and it's largely positive. In the summer of 2023, a clinical trial showed that Wegovy reduced the overall risk of cardiovascular events like heart attacks and strokes by 20%. In March 2024, the FDA approved Wegovy to reduce the risk of stroke, heart attack, and cardiovascular-related death in overweight or obese adults with heart disease. In May 2024, a summary of a large study of the active ingredient in Wegovy showed that participants who took it for 4 years managed to lose an average of 10 to 12% of their body weight and then sustain that weight loss.
Yeah.
Also in 2024, obesity levels declined for the first time in history, which is surely not a coincidence. Many
No.
people who take GLP-1s also see their blood pressure improve. What's still unclear is whether all the cardiovascular benefits come from the medicine's direct effect on blood vessels and the heart and its ability to relieve inflammation, or whether it's simply from the weight loss it brings on, which has the fringe benefit of improving heart health. In other words, we know these drugs work, but we still don't know why.
Yeah. And obesity just in general is connected with so many health challenges. And for me, the clearest signal for that was one time recently when I was in the hospital visiting a relative, and I looked around at the other people who were there, and it was a very high correlation that the people who are in the hospital being treated for various conditions on different floors, different parts of the hospital, very high percentage of people who are struggling with their weight, which then moved on to create health problems in other parts of their anatomy.
Yes, quite true. And know the stories from the COVID era too, of people who were obese were much more susceptible to serious complications from COVID. So so this is a chicken and egg thing. We don't know what causes what. We just know that these drugs are working. So here's another thing we know. The success of these drugs is putting pressure on health insurers to cover their use in non-diabetic populations. That's no small matter considering Wegovy's list price is $1,349 a month. Ozempic is $968 a month, and Mounjaro's is $1,069. Big Pharma is lobbying Congress for Medicare to cover GLP-1 drugs for obesity. And in anticipation of that reality, Morgan Stanley forecasts that by the end of this decade, domestic revenue from such drugs will increase 400-fold. Indeed, the expanded use of GLP-1 drugs from treating only type 2 diabetes to treating obesity and heart health is a boon for their manufacturers for obvious reasons. The percentage of adults worldwide living with diabetes has increased significantly over the last few decades and sits around 10% today. In a world with 8 billion people, that's 800 million potential customers. Now add to that the 16% of adults worldwide who are obese, a number that has more than doubled since 1990. That's another 1.25 billion people. More than 100 million of them are in the U.S. alone, accounting for a staggering 42% of our adult population.
Yeah. And outside of drugs like this, no real solution to that problem has been posed other than just sort of repeating the mantra that people should eat less and exercise more, which so far has not had an impact on the problem. So it's perhaps a beacon of hope in an otherwise largely hopeless scenario.
Yeah, I'm going to touch on that diet and exercise shortly, but that's the headline. That alone does not seem to help with persistent obesity.
Right.
Novo Nordisk quietly made diabetes medications for a century, but it wasn't until the FDA approved Ozempic and Wegovy for weight loss in 2017 and 2021, respectively, that it struck gold. Since then, its sales have been so strong that its market valuation now exceeds that of the rest of the Danish economy combined, which includes Denmark's other giant company, Lego.
Wow.
A study by Morgan Stanley projected that by 2030, GLP-1 drugs might be a $30 billion market in the U.S., comprising 10% of all drug purchases. At the same time, some have cautioned whether drug makers' dreams of exploding profits are realistic. If every obese American were prescribed GLP-1 drugs at current prices, the total cost would amount to more than $2 trillion a year. That's trillion with a T, which is 1/10 of the entire U.S. economy. To call that idea impractical is an understatement. It's fantasy land. That said, There's a bright ray of hope on the horizon because semaglutide, the active ingredient in Ozempic and Wegovy, becomes generic outside the US next year, 2026. And that will greatly reduce the cost for non-Americans.
Yeah, that would be huge if suddenly there are generics in this space.
Yeah. The list of things GLP-1 drugs might be good for is still expanding. There are dozens of clinical trials underway right now to determine whether they are effective in treating conditions as wide-ranging as kidney disease, liver disease, sleep apnea, and polycystic ovary syndrome. There's some data from animal studies of their effectiveness in treating depression and even substance abuse disorders, like those for alcohol, nicotine, and opioids, because of their apparent ability to inhibit cravings.
Yeah,
Some people taking GLP-1s report feeling less interested in or even repulsed by the beer or wine they once enjoyed. Studies in rats have shown that GLP-1s are effective in weaning a dependence on cocaine. And there's anecdotal evidence of users reducing other compulsive behaviors like shopping and gambling. Though no clear link has yet been established, scientists are encouraged by these findings. Because GLP-1s appear to reduce inflammation in the brain, there are now clinical trials underway about their use in preventing neurological diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's.
Yeah, just an astonishing range of conditions where it's hard to imagine how those things are linked, and yet this one drug seems to have beneficial effects in all of them. But
Yes.
what occurred to me as you're going through that is I heard someone recently suggest that the reason why drugs like Ozempic might be helpful with weight loss is if you think of obesity as essentially addiction to food. If you're thinking
Yes.
of obesity as an addiction like a nicotine addiction or an alcohol addiction, then you can lump those things together and understand how that they would all be beneficial in the same space. Though I suppose the flip side of that is I've also heard that one of the reasons why people might be reluctant to continue taking these drugs is that they enjoy the occasional beer and the occasional glass of wine, and feeling disgusted by something that you used to like is one of the costs of taking these drugs.
Yes, I've read countless articles, as I mentioned at the beginning, and a lot of the articles in the press, newspaper articles, magazine articles, are about precisely that. People's ambivalent reaction to the amazing effects of these drugs on them. And it's sometimes a trade-off for them. What's more important to you? You're losing those pounds or your lifelong love of a couple of beers at the end of the day or a glass of red wine?
Right. Because, of course, things like food and alcohol and other addictive substances serve an emotional role as well as a physiological one. It's a source of comfort, a source of pleasure in your life.
Yes.
And eliminating that pleasure might improve your physicality, your health. But it also takes something out of your life that provided comfort maybe in times when you would struggle. And so you would need then to find something else to do within those times that could give you the same or a greater level of comfort. So I could see where that could be challenging for some people.
Yeah. And to your point you made just now about obesity perhaps being an addiction to food, I want to drill down for a minute on addiction. Nicholas Reville of the Center for Addiction Science, Policy, and Research told the Chris Hayes podcast that the grand total of deaths from all forms of addiction, meaning cigarettes, alcohol, opioids, fentanyl, etc., is 767,000 per year, which is higher than for cancer.
Yeah.
And yet, the drugs that combat addiction are funded to the tune of less than 0.5% that of cancer drugs in our country. Why is that?
I can think of two possible reasons. The first is that we don't have effective drugs in that case, or the second is that we don't want effective drugs in that case because as a moralist society, we tend to blame addiction on the addict as a moral failing. And therefore you shouldn't take a drug to stop your alcohol addiction, you should be a strong enough person, a good enough person to just stop drinking on its own merits.
Yes.
That's what
Yes.
I'm kind of suspecting there.
The second answer is most certainly true, and I'm going to get to that in more detail later in this podcast. But let me pose a third answer coming from Nicholas Reville. Reville alludes to something you and I discussed in our episode about the war on cancer, which is that lay people mistakenly believe cancer is a single thing we can vanquish with one drug or approach, whereas cancer researchers know it's actually 200 different things. Similarly, addiction researchers understand that addiction is a lattice work of seemingly intractable problems. And so they believed it would never be defeated with a single medical intervention. And yet, an unintended side effect of a diabetes drug may well be that single, almost magical solution.
It's kind of humbling, isn't it? That so many of our great scientific medical advances are completely accidental. Rather than the result of human ingenuity, we just tend to fall backwards into these things. And thank God that we do, because otherwise, no penicillin, no effective treatment of bacteria, and also no Ozempic.
Right. And thank goodness we still fund research and development, although who knows whether that's going to fall to the budget cutter's axe in this administration.
Yeah.
Phase 2 trials have shown that people taking GLP-1 drugs for weight loss have a 50% lower chance of developing alcoholism or overdosing on opioids. That's astonishing to me. Yeah. Eli Lilly, the maker of Mounjaro, recently announced it will be testing similar GLP-1 molecules specifically for substance use disorders. Once again, we don't yet know the cause and effect, whether the drugs are changing people's brain chemistry or whether users' control of their eating simply makes it easier to adopt other types of self-discipline. And if you notice, Mark, that's my third mention of we don't know why. And that makes me wonder, I appreciate that the scientists are trying to figure out why, but does it really matter in the grand scheme of things? You know?
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't refuse a miracle drug because I don't understand how it works. Just like I don't refuse to drive a car just because I wouldn't be able to find the carburetor if I needed to.
Right.
Like, initially, the main thing is, does it work or does it not? And then eventually, knock on wood, we figure out why it works. And maybe that unlocks some new things. But I'll leave that to the scientists and just focus my own attention on the public health benefit.
Okay, now forgive me as I sound like one of those annoying drug ads for a minute, but it's time for the disclaimer about side effects. Overall, GLP-1s are a relatively safe class of drugs. It's important to say that at the outset. But it does have common side effects, and some of them include the loss of appetite, acid reflux, headaches, nausea, vomiting, hair loss, and what I think is a unique double whammy of diarrhea and constipation.
Damned if you do, and damned if you don't.
Right. Damned if you do. Damned if you don't.
Indeed.
Now, judging from that list I just read, I wonder whether President Trump is a GLP-1 drug because he brings on all those symptoms in me.
He does ruin my appetite now that you speak of it.
Yeah. Now, two other common side effects are the loss of muscle mass. It's estimated that 25 to 33% of the weight loss on these drugs is lean body mass, most of which is muscle. And there's also changes to your face in which the rapid loss of fat can cause wrinkles, sunken eyes, and sagging jowls. One user told the New York Times, quote, "It was almost like I didn't even recognize myself. My body looked great, but my face looked exhausted and old," end quote. Mm-hmm. Less common side effects include chronic fatigue, hypoglycemia, which is low blood sugar, pancreatitis, gallstones, kidney failure, thyroid cancer, fractures, and stomach paralysis from the slowed digestion. Also, don't use these drugs when pregnant because they can lead to fetal abnormalities.
With minds like steel traps, walking door here to discern the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. And explain it's a calling and they do it for you. Explain me, baby. Explain it's a calling that you don't do it too.
To your question about whether GLP-1s are wonder drugs or too good to be true, that's been a subject of robust national debate. To be clear, the debate is mostly centered on their application for weight loss, since their efficacy in treating diabetes is unquestioned, while the potential uses for cardiovascular health, addiction, and the rest is not yet firmly established. So here are some arguments on the wonder drug side of the ledger. For decades, get thin fast pills like amphetamines, which were highly addictive, and fen-phen, which caused heart disease, were marketed to overweight and obese people with very little long-term success. But these GLP-1 drugs appear to be delivering life-changing results that are sustainable over the long haul. They may indeed be the miracle cure for obesity, as they deliver roughly the same amount of weight loss as bariatric surgery without the invasive surgery. A successful long-term treatment for obesity, which this appears to be, would simultaneously increase people's lifespans, improve their health, and save our overtaxed medical industrial complex hundreds of billions of dollars. Notwithstanding the side effects, most doctors would readily admit that a lifetime of taking Ozempic or Wegovy is far less dangerous than a lifetime of living with diabetes or obesity or heart disease or drug abuse.
Plus, the financial consequences of those lifetime challenges would at least partly offset the cost of the drug, right? Because it's not free being obese and unhealthy because of that. That comes with its own cost, which you would need to balance against the cost of the drug.
Yes, absolutely true. Here's another positive. One of the best and most welcome effects of GLP-1 drugs is their potential to change the national conversation about obesity. Here I'm going to get to something you said a couple minutes ago. If, as many people now argue, obesity is a complex, chronic, genetic disease akin to heart disease, then it's resistant to lifestyle changes like diet and exercise alone, as we were just saying. Mm-hmm. That it can now be treated successfully by drugs counters the stubborn narrative of obesity as a moral failing and a lack of willpower. In a world of hideous, pervasive inequality where only affluent people have access to fresh produce, Twinkies cost less than strawberries, and the government subsidizes big agriculture to develop the high fructose corn syrup used in most ultra-processed foods, obese people never stood a chance. But these drugs might help to level the playing field. People who've lost weight on them report a boost of self-confidence and all the advantages that accrue to people who, as one psychologist put it, lean into feeling good about themselves. Yeah. There's also a newly won acceptance from a society that doesn't pay attention to you if you're fat. Interestingly, though they're thrilled to join the thin fraternity, these folks report being furious at getting clued into all the contempt that thin people have for fat people, a contempt they suspected or felt all along, but whose existence was finally confirmed for them after losing weight.
Yeah, they're now included in the toxic discourse that otherwise was behind their backs.
That's right, yes. If GLP-1s end up being prescribed for addiction, they can also potentially liberate people from the confines of the binary, abstinence-only model of AA and Narcotics Anonymous, where you are either an alcoholic or drug abuser or you're not. If
Yeah.
the drug short circuits your cravings for food, alcohol, or drugs, and you can sustain that for a lifetime, then maybe you're not reducible to your worst vice after all.
Right. I'd honestly be curious what a hardcore 12-step advocate would say about something like GLP-1 drugs as a treatment for addiction, because so much of that is surrendering power
Right.
and accepting that only your higher power can get you out of this condition. And yet getting a prescription for a drug kind of sounds like the sort of thing that is within your power. And so I wonder if there might be an ideological block there to seeing that as a legitimate solution. I hope not, because I would hope that they would be sensible enough to think that any path out of addiction is a successful path out of addiction. But people sometimes have strange and contradictory takes on things.
Yeah, and also I'm thinking, as you say, that kind of the provincial take that Narcotics Anonymous is like its own business model, right? And if there's now a drug for that, then it puts you out of business. So there might be some turf claiming too as part of their reaction.
Right.
But we hope everybody can be big about this and accept the successes wherever we can find them.
Yeah. Nobody would have to get rid of this notion that you're obese or you're an addict or you have one of these conditions because you are not as good a person as I am. I, who do not have those things, we would need to let go of the judgment of the people who reside in that state.
Yes.
And some people are going to struggle with that.
Yes. And I'm about to come to the negative side of the ledger, the minuses. And this is certainly one of them, what you just said. So on that negative side of the ledger, we come again to cost, but this time from the perspective of patients and insurers as opposed to manufacturers. Only the most affluent patients can afford those high prices out of pocket. Though most insurers cover GLP-1 drugs, the extent of coverage varies as they struggle with the huge cost of treating widespread conditions like diabetes and obesity. And thus far, they've been reluctant to cover off-label uses until FDA approvals are in place and the science is irrefutable. Government insurers like Medicare and Medicaid have classified some of these medications as vanity drugs, even though they're being prescribed for obesity. That decision flies in the face of the most recent research on obesity that I mentioned earlier as a chronic disease. As one obesity specialist working for a New York City hospital told the New York Times, quote, "The evidence is now overwhelming that there are physical changes in weight-regulating pathways that make it difficult for people to lose weight and maintain their weight loss. It's not that they don't have willpower. Something physical is holding them back." End quote.
Yeah.
Despite it being one of the biggest medical challenges of our time, only 1% of American doctors are trained in obesity medicine. Perhaps that explains why, until quite recently, only a tiny percentage of eligible patients receive these drugs, roughly the same number that got bariatric surgery, which is covered by Medicare. The numbers are rising due to the popularity of GLP-1 drugs, but there's a lot of catching up to do. It seems almost cruel that the same medication is available for treating type 2 diabetes at a 50% lower price that is covered by all insurers.
I think the recent example of United Healthcare's declarations makes it clear how insurance companies think about these things. It's a financial decision rather than a human decision. And so they would weigh the cost of the drug against the human lives being saved. And in many cases, they might think it's better to deny than it is to approve. And then to paper that over by referring to it as a cosmetic or a vanity issue rather than a vital health issue.
Right. Which kind of explains why Luigi Mangione is a folk hero today. I'm not saying I feel that way, but it certainly explains that phenomenon.
Yeah.
Compounded medications are formulated by special compounding pharmacies to meet a patient's specific needs. They comprise about 1 to 3% of prescriptions in the United States. When you need a specific dosage or a certain combination of drugs that isn't commercially available. People have taken to ordering compounded GLP-1s because they're cheaper than the brand names. But compounded drugs are not FDA approved or reviewed for safety, effectiveness, or quality before they are marketed. The compound may use a slightly different version of the drug or at an incorrect dosage. As of December 2024, the so-called adverse events from compounded versions of GLP-1 drugs reported to the FDA numbered in the hundreds. But because federal law doesn't require some state-licensed pharmacies to report such events to the FDA, it's likely they're underreported. So basically, you take the compounded versions of these drugs at your own risk.
Yeah.
Now, the muscle loss I mentioned earlier is so concerning that some doctors recommend that their patients on GLP-1s adopt a high-protein diet and do resistance training to counteract the effects of the drug. But that advice is hard to implement when your appetite has been suppressed and you're too tired to exercise.
Sure.
Some people can't tolerate GLP-1 drugs because of the constant nausea and vomiting they induce. Others accept those extreme side effects and even worse as the price they're willing to pay to get thin. And to that point, the fact that GLP-1 drugs are effective for weight loss is not lost on the privileged class. A dermatologist working on the Upper East Side of Manhattan talked to the New York Times about the popularity of Mounjaro, which is considered by those in the know to be the best for weight loss with minimal side effects. Quote, "Everybody is either on it or asking how to get on it. We haven't seen a prescription drug with this much cocktail and dinner chatter since Viagra came to the market." End quote.
Yeah, I've been thinking about Viagra through much of this recording because it seems like a real parallel where Viagra was out of nowhere and again, an accidental discovery. I think Viagra was originally a blood pressure medication that turned out to have therapeutic effects on erectile dysfunction and then was a huge moneymaker for that company, largely for reasons that you could brand as frivolous and yet were very important within the lives of the people who took it. And so same condition for these drugs. Accidental discovery that has a huge health and lifestyle impact on the people who take it and enormous moneymaker for the company. And so it is kind of the Viagra for weight loss. And I've heard online that if a celebrity suddenly loses weight, even if they don't admit that they're taking a GLP-1 drug, people in the comments on their social posts are making snide remarks about how it's probably drug-induced weight loss, which honestly I'm fine with. I don't mind, but it is a bit of a stigma currently, at least within the celebrity community.
Yeah, I think that's a really good parallel. And I was just about to say something about celebrities, so you anticipated where I'm going with this. People who aren't obese but just want to look better, like those folks on the Upper East Side I just mentioned, but including many Hollywood celebrities, have been pressuring their providers to prescribe GLP-1 drugs to them, creating both a nationwide shortage and a parade of emergency room visits for unexpected side effects. Journalists have written about how shockingly easy it is to get prescriptions, even when they admit they're not obese and don't really need the drugs, and how little oversight is given to the pharmacies that crank them out. Meanwhile, the people who arguably need these medications the most, poor people, people in rural areas, and people of color for whom diabetes and obesity rates are the highest, either can't get them because they're being prescribed to people who really don't need them, or they can't afford them when their insurers refuse to pay for them to treat anything other than diabetes. Even when insurance does cover them, doctors have described the absurdity of being able to prescribe ultra-expensive Wegovy for obese children whose parents can't afford to buy them fresh fruits and vegetables.
Yeah, that's definitely out of whack.
Despite the current thinking about obesity as a chronic disease, some think these drugs only intensify an already deep implicit bias against fat in our culture. Many people taking GLP-1s to reverse a lifetime of overeating report struggling with the fear that others will judge them for receiving injections to treat their obesity rather than summoning the willpower to lose weight and then keep it off. This is what you were just saying, and you're right about that. In other words, they took the easy way out. That's what people think. Part of the problem is that, unlike other chronic health conditions like high blood pressure, obesity is plainly visible, which makes it easier to stigmatize. This recurrence of fat shaming is undoing a decades-long movement for body positivity, or at least acceptance of the bodies people were born with. Writing in the New Yorker, Gia Tolentino observed that the arrival of GLP-1 drugs, quote, seems to have prompted less a public consideration of what it means to be fat than a renewed fixation on being thin, end quote. If the sickly thin, heroin chic body is in again, that's not welcome news for most women who have what I would call real women's bodies. The fallout from the decision to use GLP-1s for obesity can also affect intimate relationships. Research about the effects of bariatric surgery on patients' lives showed that single people who had the surgery were more likely to marry afterwards, but married couples were more likely to separate or divorce. Thus far, the research is mixed on whether GLP-1 drugs decrease or increase one's libido, but that doesn't solely explain their effect on relationships. One clinical psychologist told the New York Times that in long-term couples, quote, when one person changes, it changes the system. It does break that unspoken contract, end quote. The disruption of well-established habits and routines seems to be a through line for GLP-1 use, with press accounts full of anecdotes about the effect it's having on long-term partners. People on these drugs also report losing many of their friends, again for complicated psychological reasons, but also because the drugs are seen as vanity medications, in no small part because of how many Kardashians, Real Housewives, and other rich people are using them. And there's also this. To the extent they are now used to treat chronic conditions like diabetes and obesity, GLP-1 drugs are considered by doctors to be forever medications, similar to cholesterol-lowering statins. They stop working the minute you stop taking them. If you go off GLP-1s, chances are you'll regain much of that weight you lost, and most of it will be fat, not muscle. Factor in the side effects, insurers' unwillingness to pay for perpetual use, and the fact that some patients don't like to stay on medications for the rest of their lives, especially relatively new drugs like these for which we don't have longitudinal data. And the decision about whether to take them becomes very complicated. Some medical experts think that people might opt to take them until their weight plateaus at some significantly lower number, then ditch them as they try to maintain their new weight with better exercise and eating habits. That sounds to me like the on-again, off-again diet regimes that most of us have tried, the cycles of weight loss and gain that ultimately lead to net muscle loss and a lot of frustration. The drug makers have responded by testing new combination therapies that pair weight loss GLP-1s with muscle-enhancing antibodies, so stay tuned. The most alarming thing I read in all my research on this topic, Mark, was that the American Pediatric Association recently added bariatric surgery and GLP-1 drugs to its menu of treatments for children with obesity. Let's put that in perspective. Our country is currently aflame over so-called gender-affirming care that might include surgery and puberty blockers for the teeny tiny percentage of kids with gender dysphoria. While the fact that millions of fat kids might soon be given major stomach surgery or a weight loss drug that Gia Tolentino calls an injectable eating disorder, that they have to stay on for the rest of their lives, has generated not a ripple of public dissent as far as I can tell. It sure seems like we're missing the forest for the trees.
Or applying a huge double standard where the mainstream American might be uncomfortable with a trans child, but at the same time feel that a fat child has a problem that needs to be solved. It seems like those winds are blowing in the same direction in some respect. And so it does feel consistent for me that you'd be more sanguine about something that solves the fat kid problem than you would be about allowing that kid to decide whether or not they're a he or a she.
Yeah, no, that's certainly true. I guess I was just pointing out the magnitude is so starkly different. 40% of the country is overweight, so a lot of kids are going to get this surgery and take these drugs, and it just seems appalling to me that that's nobody's batting an eye over that.
Yeah, 100%.
Upon consideration of everything I just presented, my conclusion is that both possibilities posed by your question are true. From all available evidence to date, GLP-1s do seem capable of delivering penicillin magnitude improvement to health outcomes in many different areas, saving people from the ravages of diabetes, obesity, heart disease, drug abuse, and who knows what else. At the same time, they're too good to be true because of the inordinate, unreasonable weight we're putting on them to solve cultural, political, and socioeconomic problems that mere medications are not designed to solve. The Atlantic's Derek Thompson wrote of Ozempic and Wegovy that they, quote, seem to collapse the complex interplay of genes, environment, diet, metabolism, and exercise into a simple injection with a luxury price tag, end quote. Our ability to capably deliver the 21st century's miracle drug to the millions of people, rich and especially poor, who desperately need it, will be the real miracle.
Yeah. And personally, I'm fascinated about what happens next. Imagine that through generics, the price does come down to a manageable point, and it does get applied to the health challenges of this country. What happens after that? Because I know that for me, before I listen to this, one of my concerns is that you take Ozempic as a way to eat anything you wanted without any consequences. But now you tell me that actually it makes you less likely to want to do that. So that's actually not a problem. But you do wonder, what are the unintended consequences? Some good, some bad, social consequences of obesity being taken off the table that way, or addiction being cut in half that way. What do we not anticipate? And I don't think that's an answerable question, but that's where my head's at right now. Is if this does have a huge effect on health outcomes in this country, probably that's not going to usher in a golden age. So what would it usher in?
Yeah, I'm with you all the way on that. And the medical establishment will need to run longitudinal studies to see what kind of medical and physical effects it's having. But the psychological and social effects are already being reported. And that's why I devoted some time near the end to the talk about relationships. Mark, I read so many articles about long-term couples who are estranged from each other after one of them goes on one of these drugs. And the other one would say something like, I liked my wife's plump, cozy body. I love to bury my head in her tummy. And, this sounds silly, but this is actually very profound. It could be tearing people apart, and those kind of effects we're running like a natural experiment, in real time. Right. These things are happening, and who knows, some of the papers that are written about Ozempic 20 years from now might not be written by medical researchers. They might be written in the Journal of Psychology about how it's changed our intimate relationships.
Yeah, I've always thought that the biggest challenge in a marriage is that you get married with the hope that the other person will never change, and yet you and that other person are constantly changing. And so to be
Yes.
in a marriage for a long time, you need to figure out a way to stay in love and stay on the same page with someone who's very different from the person you married, very different from the
Yes.
person you first met. And so I suppose
Yes.
part of the challenge of these drugs within a relationship is that the change is so rapid that you
That's right.
thought that you knew this person, and then suddenly they look different, they feel different, they act different, they behave different.
Right.
And so it's a lot to adjust to. I could see where it would be difficult on a relationship level to recalibrate in that way.
Yes. Yes, because the growth that occurs inside relationships is an age-old issue, right? But I think you put your finger on it. It's the rapidity of the changes with these weight loss drugs, how stark they are and how fast they happen, that makes them, I think, particularly challenging in a social context going forward. But we'll see, maybe this is the price
Right.
we have to pay to have a 21st century miracle drug.
And I, for one, would look forward to living in a society that thinks of obesity as a medical condition rather than a moral failing. I feel like that would be a solid step forward for all of us. If we can just get
Yes.
out of the look at that lazy, self-indulgent fat person and instead look at that person with a health condition that has not yet been treated. I feel like we would be in a better place like that.
Agreed. All right. Well, I hope I
thank you.
answered your question to the best of my ability. I hope it was sufficient.
It certainly was very thought-provoking, and I enjoyed this conversation, so thank you.
You're welcome. And I've got a question for you now for next time. You ready for this?
Bring it on.
All right. Okay, Mark, as you may have heard, it was big news here in New York City. The New York Yankees just relaxed their nearly 50-year-old rules governing the facial hair of their players.
I did hear that, yeah.
Instead of banning all beards, the Yankees will now permit well-groomed beards. So I guess Jesus Christ still isn't eligible to play in the Bronx.
Yeah, Rasputin would have been sent back to AAA.
Yes, right. So you could probably tell from that joke that I think the Yankees' policy was petty and silly, and I would have preferred it be eliminated altogether. But anyway, that got me thinking about dress and grooming codes in general. And so I ask you, where do they come from? Is there a beneficial purpose served by making people cut their hair or making kids wear uniforms to school? Or for that matter, relaxing the rules on casual Fridays? Or are these all merely instruments of control?
Interesting. And I have to say, I feel like this is more a Mark question than a Joe question, so you surprised me with this one, but I look forward to jumping into that one. And I'll come back suitably groomed for our conversation in 2 or 3 weeks' time. Until then, I will leave you all to consider your own hairstyles and your mode of dress. This is Mark, and that was Joe, and we will see you later.
Talk to you next time.
With GLPs, will I be A-okay? And feeling LOL. Without them at my DOA, only time will tell. Big Pharma's rolling in the dough. Fat Tony finally fits into his pants. You two might be good to go if you just give the shot a chance. So I'm taking the shot. It's for diabetes. It's for obesity. But is it for me? Yeah, it might make me barf on your new scarf, but it might just be the answer to my prayers. Sure, it causes diarrhea, bad idea, but that's why God made clean underwear. Fat is out, thin is in, and I have a double chin, so I have to take the shot, though it's expensive. FDA, earn goodwill, make insurance pay the bill, so the damage ain't so fiscally extensive. That's why I'm taking the shot. It's for addiction, it's for memory, but will it be for me? Yeah, I'm taking the shot. It's for diabetes, it's for obesity. then it better be for me.
Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Music composed and performed by the Mansplaining House Band. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you next time.
Attention mansplaining listeners. If you want to engage with Mark and me, you have some options. One is to go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast, where you can leave a comment or question, check our sources, suggest topics for future episodes, or just like us, because who doesn't want to be liked? You can also reach us through whatever app you use to listen to this podcast by giving us a 5-star rating or writing a review of your favorite episode. Or you can call and leave us a message on our dedicated voicemail box, which is 206-486-4074. It's lonely in podcast land, and we welcome and appreciate any feedback you might want to share. Act now, and we'll throw in a set of Ginsu knives. Not really.